The author and pastor John Bell has written a new book called Love Wins. Perhaps you saw the Time magazine cover story a month or so ago titled, No Hell. The book is Bell's description of the way that a focus on getting into heaven has missed the bigger message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Just like James and John in our text this morning, many people and churches have focused on the individual salvation as the primary message. Bell writes, when people say that Jesus came to die on the cross so that we can have a relationship with God, yes, that is true. But when that explanation, as the first explanation, puts us at the center of the equation, when Jesus is presented only as the answer that saves individuals from their sin and death, we run the risk of shrinking the gospel down to something that is just for a select group of human beings. And the reality is, God inaugurated a movement in Jesus' resurrection to renew, to restore, and to reconcile everything on earth and in heaven, just as God originally intended. Every single thing. No exceptions. That is Bell's premise for his book. The problem begins when we focus all of our attention on what will come of us in the future. When we are so concerned about our future status, we can't focus on what God intends for us here and now. What we conceive is not necessarily what God intends. If we are open to the unexpected moments in our life, open to God's call for us in the moment, we will be reminded that life is more than just about our plans. A pastor in Atlanta caught himself in one of these moments when he recalled an interaction with his daughter one afternoon. It was one of those days, he writes, when everybody and his brother and sister and cousin and aunt and uncle had been after me. By the end of the day, I felt like a chocolate chip cookie that everybody had taken a piece of. And I was looking forward to getting home. I planned to walk into the house, to take off my tie, to go to my study and not be bothered, and just let my soul catch up with my body, just to relax. But when I arrived at home, there stood one of my daughters in the carport, lined up with 3 of her friends, standing there in solemn assembly. I noticed that there was a little shoebox under her arm, and I remember thinking, I wonder what that is. I got out of the car, and my daughter said, "Oh, Daddy, I'm so glad you're home. I told my friends that you would do something." And I said, I'd be glad to. What would you like me to do? And she said, "Have a funeral for this dead frog we found." Now I want to tell you, can't you picture it? I'm marching down through the woods before this little group. I am not only the preacher, but I am also the funeral director and grave digger. It is the first time that I've ever had a funeral where I carried the shovel with me. And that frog, I tell you, that frog was thrice dead. I could have picked it up by one foot and sailed it like a frisbee. But I want to tell you that I put him away. No frog south of God ever had a better funeral. And then I hugged, and everybody prayed together, thanking God for the creatures, great and small. And I went to my study, and the children were happy, and all was well. Many years later, my daughter's teacher told me that she wrote an essay, and in it she said, "I know my daddy loved me when he had a funeral for a frog." Bell would argue that heaven itself was experienced in that moment. Bell suggests that heaven is really a place where God's will is done, And it's not at some point in the future or in some distant place up high. Where God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven, that's when there will be no separation between the two. Heaven is the place where God's will is done. And when God's will is done, heaven breaks into the present, even if just for a moment. He goes on to point out that taking heaven seriously means that we also take seriously suffering here and now. It's not that we've bought into a myth that we can create a utopia given enough time and technology and good voting choices, but because we have great confidence that God has not abandoned human history and is in fact actively working in our lives right here, right now. The brothers James and John ask Jesus for a favor. Grant us to sit one on your right hand and one on your left in your glory. And Jesus' question to them is one of reorientation. Can you drink the cup that I drink? Jesus is trying to get them to focus on the present moment. There are a lot of things that are going to happen before we get to glory, he's saying. Can you be baptized with me into all of my life, the good, the bad, birth, life, death? Glory is coming, but what about now? Is there no heaven here? What about what God needs of you today? He's warning them not to spend all of their time jockeying for positions of power and honor and wondering about future legacy and status. Jesus plants them squarely in the present moment with the work that is before them. There is nothing immediately glorious about the work of the kingdom. In fact, there are hard times coming. Maybe your hard times are already here. As it so happens, the road to glory leads right through the reality of suffering and sacrifice. Can you partake of that with me? Jesus asks. Henry Nouwen, in his book titled "Can You Drink the Cup?", describes how that very question has changed for him over the years. From a young priest fresh from seminary to the parish, to faculty positions at Harvard and Yale, and finally to a community of people he served with severe mental disabilities and their caretakers. For me, he writes, a newly ordained priest full of ideas and ideals seemed to be so rich with promises. I was eager to drink the cup. Today, sitting in front of a low table surrounded by men and women with mental disabilities, offering them the cup, that same question is one of spiritual challenge. Can we drink the cup that Jesus drank? Can we taste all of the sorrows and the joys that it will bring? The wisdom of years knows that to follow Jesus is a difficult and risky proposition. And it's also one that is filled with a hard-earned joy and fullness. Mark's gospel introduces us to more and more people who are ready for the joy in the midst of a difficult life. And Jesus offers them a more joyful way, but not without its own challenges and risks. Heaven is not free of challenges, but it is full of joy. James and John's request is so obviously inappropriate and naive to us as we read it. Where have they been? Haven't they paid attention to anything that Jesus has been saying about denying themselves and taking up the cross and following? Did they miss it when Jesus confronted the rich man with his need to part with his possessions because his money was in the way, his status was in the way of the relationship? The brothers' desire for status is in their way. And just a few verses later in this chapter, a few verses earlier, Jesus blesses a group of children that the disciples assume to be a nuisance. Truly, I tell you, whoever doesn't receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it. Jesus replies to them. This is another one of those scriptures that I hear differently now that I have children. It's not that children are completely selfless. This is a surprise to me, of course. In fact, they're very self-focused. But children are dependent on us for just about everything. They are innocently and humbly dependent on us, and yet they are totally focused on the present. All there is for a small child is here and now. The first time I dropped my children off at daycare, I was warned by my wife that they would likely cry. And sure enough, after I had put up their coats and their lunches, my daughter, who was still hanging on to me, as I went to put her down and said, "Okay, time for Daddy to go," she immediately clung and started to cry, big crocodile tears. You know, the crying that sounds like they will be heartbroken forever, or at least until you get back. And I left the room and I stood in the hall for about 10 seconds when the crying stopped and she went over to the shelf and started to pull toys to play with. Focused on that moment. The moment was over and she had moved on to the next. And Jesus calls us to be more like children, humbly, knowingly dependent on God's grace, and focused on the work of the kingdom here and now in this moment. James and John were not focused on the work at hand, but instead on the end reward and on the life to come. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, Jesus does not get angry with them, but he tries to tell them what needs to be done now. Jesus is telling them in as many ways as he can that faithfulness is found in doing the work and serving the community. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. Do the work. Love your neighbor. Don't let money be the master. Be in the moment like a child and follow me. That is what Jesus has been telling them all throughout the gospel. The disciples are central to all of these stories because this chosen group of leaders doesn't understand at first. Most of us don't understand at first. And yet Jesus keeps on teaching them and reminding them about what the ministry is all about. And eventually, with time, with experience, they start to get it. They understand what Jesus meant when he asks, "Are you willing to drink the cup that I drink?"